All right, guys, let's move on. We're getting closer to the end of our plant chapter finally. So let's talk about how they reproduce. We already mentioned at the very beginning of this chapter that plants have this interesting means of reproduction. They go through this process called alternation of generations. And we talked about how that word alternation means switching. Well, what are they switching from or between? They're switching between a gametophyte stage and a sporophyte stage. And here's what I want you to know. The gametophyte stage specifically is going to produce haploid gametes. Remember what I mean by haploid? Haploid is one set of chromosomes, only one. And a gamete, remember, is our reproductive cell. So this is going to be a sperm and egg. And the reason why it has to be haploid is because we can't make these freak of natures. You can't have two diploid cells coming together because then that gives you a being or thing with 4 sets of chromosomes, and that's not compatible with any type of life. So we have these haploid gametes. They only have one set of chromosomes. That way, when you have sperm fertilizing egg, you end up with what we call a diploid zygote. And you need to know that. Diploid zygote is what happens when two haploid gametes combine. That's fertilization. And the diploid zygote that we make in this plant life cycle, we know that as the seed. So, the gametophyte produces the gametes. Pretty sure that will be a quiz or test question, FYI. And then those gametes, the sperm and the egg, sperm fertilizes egg to produce a diploid zygote. And like I said, in this plant life cycle, we call that the seed. Once the zygote germinates, and germinates is that term we use for when that seed starts to grow, the diploid plant that emerges is known as the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is the diploid plant that came out of the seed. And the sporophyte stage, its whole job is to produce spores. So the sporophyte stage of reproduction produces spores. And the spores germinate to form the gametophyte. And the gametophyte produces the gametes, which combine to form the zygote. And that seed produces the sporophyte. The sporophyte produces the spores, which germinate to form the gametophyte. So you see this kind of back and forth, this alternation of generations. We go back and forth between the gametophyte and the sporophyte stage. That's called the alternation of generations. This is a sexual reproductive cycle, which means you're getting a mix of genetic information. You are getting diversity as far as the genes go, and that is a good thing. All right, so in our plants that have vascular tissue, which would be our ferns, our gymnosperms, and our angiosperms, it's going to be the sporophyte stage, which is the most dominant and the most visible. In our non-vascular plants, like the mosses, it's the gametophyte stage. That's the most dominant or most visible. So the vascular tissue, guys, what we see is the sporophyte stage. The moss and the non-vascular guys, what we see would be the gametophyte stage. So let's talk about the mosses. A couple things I want you to know about the mosses. They're the largest groups of the bryophytes. And remember, bryophyte was that fancy word for non-vascular plant. They're extremely adaptable. You can find them in harsh, cold areas. You can find them in hot, tropical rainforest. But you're going to find them by water. Why? Well, they don't have that vascular tissue. They can't absorb water and transport it throughout that plant. And so all parts of that guy need to be able to absorb water. So the green part that we see when we look at the moss is what's called the leafy shoot. That's the green stuff that we looked at underneath the little stereoscope from the USSR. Its whole job is to collect water and nutrients. And that's why pretty much the whole moss looks the same. It's because it's all full of these leafy shoots. All parts of that moss has to be able to collect water and nutrients, kind of like a paper towel has to absorb water. Now, these guys don't have roots. What they have are rhizoids. You have to know that word. Their job is to anchor. It is not to absorb water and transport through the plant. That is not its job. It's not going to absorb water and nutrients like true roots on a plant. Rhizoid's job is to anchor and hold them in place because we are finding these guys around water. Well, I'm at risk of being washed away. So those rhizoids help to keep me in place. And so the leafy shoots are the gametophytes that were produced. And some of the leafy shoots produce the male gametes, which would be the sperm. And then some of the leafy shoots are going to produce the female gamete, which is going to be the egg. So you do have kind of different genders of the leafy shoots. Like I said, some produce the sperm, some produce the egg. And so when you have water splashing onto the leafy shoots that have the sperm will be released. That water will carry the sperm to help it get to the egg inside the female leafy shoots. And so when the sperm and egg unite, they form the zygote. That zygote, starts the stage of the sporophyte stage, and then that will eventually become the mature sporophyte, which will then be able to release the spores. And once those spores are released, they will germinate and form the new gametophyte. So this is what that question was meaning on the lab. Why is this tied to water for reproduction, or why is it not? Mosses are dependent on water for reproduction. It has to have that water to help the sperm on the male leafy shoot get to the egg on the female leafy shoot. Once fertilization happens, you get that diploid zygote, and then that's going to form into this sporophyte. And you don't see this that for that long on our moss, but you get this little sporophyte stage, which produces spores. Those spores will then be released and they will germinate, and that spore is basically going to grow up and become these leafy shoots, which is what we know and we see as the moss. All right, let's talk for a minute about ferns. A couple things I want you to know. They may look delicate, but they are a very hardy group of vascular yet seedless plants. Remember that? Some of them can go dormant during dry periods, which means they can kind of like go to sleep and kind of hang out. So they say that some of those can stay that way for up to 100 years. So these guys are very tough. So the leaves of a fern are called the fronds. So the fronds are the leaves. You need to know that. And again, these guys are vascular, so they have the ability to grow quite large. Now the fern is pretty interesting. They have these underground stems called rhizomes. A rhizome needs to, in your mind, be connected with a fern. Rhizoid goes with a moss. A rhizome goes with a fern, and it's an underground stem. And it helps to produce the root and store nutrients. Now, on the underside of the frond, so remember when you looked at your fern leaf, you saw all of these kind of brown spots on it. And one of the questions on the lab was like, it asked about the guy selling plants and if the plant was sick, and you said no, the fern is supposed to look like that. We're supposed to have these brown spots on the underside of the fern frond. It's called the sori, and they're structures that house and protect the sporangia, which basically produce the spores. And so they're going to produce the spores. Those spores will be released, and they will germinate to become the gametophyte stage of the fern. Now, those spores will start to germinate, and the spores will turn into the prothallus, which is kind of like this heart-shaped. Here we go. Here's a better picture because you guys know I'm not an artist. Here's our fern frond. On the underneath, you've got those brown spots, all the sori. They have the sporangia, which produce the spores. I do want you to know that those sori help produce the spores. Those spores will be released, and they're going to grow into this structure, which is the prothallus, and it is heart-shaped. It's kind of cute. But of course, when you think of a fern, you're not thinking of this little guy, because this guy, that little prothallus, he's pretty small, he's flat, kind of just lays on the ground. Usually when we think of a fern, we're thinking of that guy right there. And that's why we say that the fern is mostly seen in the sporophyte stage. So the sporangia releases the spores. The spores germinate, grow into this little prothallus. You have two areas on the prothallus to produce the sperm and the egg. And of course, you know the story. Sperm has to fertilize egg, and that becomes the zygote. And then that zygote will end up growing into your fern. This cute little guy right here is what we call the fiddlehead. The fiddlehead is just the emerging fern frond. Notice how he's kind of curled up. As he starts to grow, that fern frond is going to unravel to become the fern frond that you're used to seeing. All right, so make sure that you've read these sections in your book. Take notes. Notice the bold and italic terms. Take good notes. Our test is going to be the Wednesday after Easter. And when I get back tomorrow, we will talk about gymnosperms and angiosperms and then test next week.